In the shadows of the Cold War, fear became a weapon. Not the kind fired from a rifle or launched from a missile, but something far more intimate, something that lived inside the human mind. At the height of America's struggle against unseen enemies, a quiet question haunted intelligence officials: what if loyalty could be erased, memories rewritten, and obedience implanted? Behind closed doors, inside government offices with no public oversight, a line was crossed. Ordinary citizens, prisoners, patients, and soldiers became subjects in experiments they never agreed to. Some were told they were helping science. Others were told nothing at all. Documents were stamped, files were hidden, and names were erased. For years, even decades, the truth remained buried, protected by secrecy and justified by national security. But what happens when a government decides that the human mind itself is a battlefield? This is not a story about science fiction. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented chapter of American history, one that raises uncomfortable questions about ethics, power, and how far a democracy can go when fear takes control. Tonight, we begin the story of MKUltra, a program designed to explore the limits of the human mind, and in doing so, tested the limits of American values. To understand MKUltra, we must first understand the world that created it. The late 1940s and early 1950s were defined by anxiety. World War II had ended, but peace did not follow. Instead, a new conflict emerged, one without clear front lines or formal declarations. The Cold War transformed global politics into a constant state of suspicion. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a struggle not just for territory or influence, but for ideology. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom versus control. Every scientific breakthrough, every military advancement, and every intelligence operation was viewed through this lens of existential threat. Reports began circulating within American intelligence agencies that enemy states were experimenting with psychological manipulation. Prisoners of war returning from Korea described strange interrogations and sudden ideological shifts. The term brainwashing entered the public vocabulary, fueling fears that the human mind could be turned against itself. In Washington, this fear was taken seriously. If adversaries could manipulate thoughts, extract secrets, or alter behavior, then national security was at risk. The question was no longer whether the mind could be influenced, but whether the United States was already behind. The Central Intelligence Agency, still a relatively young organization, was tasked with preventing strategic surprise. Its mission was broad, its authority often vague, and its activities largely shielded from public scrutiny. Within this environment, unconventional ideas found fertile ground. Psychology and psychiatry were rapidly evolving fields. New drugs were being synthesized. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and behavioral conditioning were being studied in academic settings. What had once belonged to philosophy was now being tested in laboratories. The boundaries between ethical research and strategic experimentation began to blur. Intelligence officials believed that understanding and potentially controlling the human mind was not optional. It was essential. This was the climate in which MKUltra was born. Not as a single experiment, but as a vast network of research projects spread across universities, hospitals, prisons, and military facilities. Many participants believed they were contributing to legitimate science. Few were aware of the program's true purpose. What followed was not chaos, but structure. Budgets were approved. Researchers were recruited. Methods were tested. And secrecy became policy. The origins of MKUltra can be traced to the early 1950s, when the CIA began formally exploring behavioral science as a tool of intelligence. In 1953, the program was officially authorized under the direction of CIA leadership, though its foundations had already been laid by earlier projects. At the center of MKUltra was a belief that the human mind could be broken down and rebuilt. This belief was not fringe. It was shared by respected scientists and reinforced by wartime experiences in interrogation and psychological warfare. The program was placed under the control of the CIA's Technical Services Division, which handled unconventional tools and methods. Rather than operating as a single laboratory, MKUltra functioned as an umbrella funding dozens of sub-projects, often without the knowledge of their true sponsor. One of the earliest decisions was to distance the CIA from direct involvement. Funds were funneled through front organizations and foundations. Universities and medical institutions received grants without being told the ultimate source. This created plausible deniability, and it worked. Researchers explored a wide range of techniques. Psychoactive substances were of particular interest, especially newly discovered compounds that appeared to alter perception, memory, and suggestibility. Other studies focused on isolation, stress, repetition, and environmental manipulation. Crucially, informed consent was not always considered necessary. In some cases, it was seen as an obstacle. The logic was simple and dangerous: if a method worked only when the subject was unaware, then awareness defeated the purpose. Internal documents framed these activities as defensive. If enemies were developing mind control techniques, the United States needed to understand them first. But over time, the scope expanded. The goal was no longer just understanding, it was application. MKUltra grew quietly. Oversight was minimal. Results were difficult to measure, and failures were often undocumented. What mattered was persistence, not proof. By the late 1950s, MKUltra had become one of the CIA's most secretive programs. Few outside the agency knew it existed. Fewer still understood its reach. And while the public remained unaware, a system was now in place, one that prioritized secrecy over transparency, and experimentation over ethics. The consequences of these early decisions would echo far beyond the Cold War itself. As MKUltra expanded, silence became more than a byproduct of secrecy, it became a deliberate system. The program operated in an environment where questioning authority was discouraged and oversight was intentionally fragmented. No single individual held the full picture, and that fragmentation was not accidental. Within the CIA, MKUltra was compartmentalized. Subprojects were assigned numbers rather than descriptive titles. Reports were circulated internally with limited distribution. Many officials approved funding without understanding the exact nature of the experiments being conducted. This bureaucratic design ensured that accountability dissolved across layers of administration. Ethical review boards, as we understand them today, did not meaningfully exist. Medical ethics were still evolving, and national security concerns frequently overrode moral hesitation. The assumption was simple: extraordinary threats justified extraordinary measures. What mattered was results, not process. Subjects were often chosen for their vulnerability. Prisoners, psychiatric patients, and individuals on the margins of society were easier to access and less likely to be believed if they later spoke out. In some cases, participants were told they were receiving legitimate treatment. In others, they were given no explanation at all. Consent, when it existed, was often incomplete or misleading. The full nature of the experiments, the risks, the objectives, the potential consequences, was rarely disclosed. Internally, this was rationalized as necessary. Officials argued that true reactions could only be observed when subjects were unaware. Failures were quietly ignored. Experiments that produced confusion, distress, or psychological harm were documented clinically, but rarely questioned strategically. There was no clear threshold at which the program paused to reassess its moral direction. As years passed, MKUltra became normalized within the agency. It was no longer viewed as experimental, it was operational. The secrecy surrounding it deepened, not because of external pressure, but because silence had become policy. This systemic failure was not the result of a single decision or one individual's ambition. It was the outcome of a structure that rewarded compliance, discouraged dissent, and treated ethical concerns as secondary to perceived national survival. The effects of MKUltra did not end when experiments concluded. For many individuals involved, the consequences extended far beyond the laboratory or testing environment. Psychological confusion, mistrust of institutions, and long-lasting emotional distress became part of their lives. Some participants struggled to reconcile fragmented memories with official denials. Others questioned their own experiences, unsure whether what they remembered was real or imagined. This uncertainty itself became a lasting burden. Beyond individual impact, MKUltra cast a broader shadow over American society. Trust in government institutions, already strained by war and political scandals, was further eroded. When the idea emerged that a democratic government had secretly experimented on its own citizens, it challenged deeply held assumptions about transparency and accountability. Academically, MKUltra influenced how behavioral science was perceived. Legitimate research into psychology and psychiatry became entangled with suspicion. Ethical safeguards tightened, not only because of scientific progress, but because of public disillusionment. Culturally, MKUltra entered the American imagination as a symbol of hidden power. It influenced literature, film, and public discourse not as fiction, but as a reminder that reality could be stranger and darker than imagined. Perhaps most importantly, MKUltra reshaped discussions about consent, autonomy, and the limits of state authority. It forced a reckoning with the idea that intelligence operations, when left unchecked, could drift far from democratic values. The long shadow of MKUltra is not defined solely by what happened, but by how long it remained hidden, and how deeply that secrecy affected public trust once revealed. The exposure of MKUltra was not sudden. It emerged gradually, through investigative journalism, congressional inquiries, and fragmented document releases. In the 1970s, amid a broader atmosphere of skepticism toward government authority, questions began to surface. Congressional committees were formed to investigate intelligence activities. During these hearings, references to secret behavioral experiments began to appear. What initially seemed abstract quickly became concrete as witnesses testified and documents were uncovered. However, much of the original MKUltra documentation had already been destroyed. This decision, made internally years earlier, severely limited the scope of accountability. What survived were fragments enough to confirm the program's existence, but not enough to fully reconstruct its reach. The public reaction was one of shock and disbelief. Media coverage emphasized the ethical implications rather than sensational details. The idea that American institutions had violated their own principles resonated deeply with audiences already grappling with political disillusionment. Victims came forward, though many struggled to be heard. Legal challenges followed, but compensation and closure proved difficult. Without complete records, responsibility remained diffuse. Exposure did not provide simple answers. Instead, it raised enduring questions: how much power should intelligence agencies hold? Who watches the watchers? And what safeguards are necessary to prevent history from repeating itself? MKUltra was no longer just a secret program. It had become a public symbol of unchecked authority and a cautionary tale. In the years following the public exposure of MKUltra, the United States government faced an uncomfortable reality: trust had been damaged not by a foreign enemy, but from within. The revelations forced lawmakers, intelligence officials, and the public to confront the consequences of secrecy unchecked by accountability. Congressional investigations resulted in new oversight mechanisms for intelligence agencies. Committees were established with the explicit responsibility of monitoring covert operations, budgets, and ethical compliance. While these reforms did not erase the past, they marked a structural shift in how intelligence work was governed. Within the scientific and medical communities, MKUltra became a turning point. Institutional review boards gained authority, and informed consent became a central requirement for human research. What had once been loosely regulated was now scrutinized through ethical frameworks designed to protect participants rather than institutions. The CIA itself acknowledged failures, though often in limited terms. Official statements framed MKUltra as a product of its time, an era defined by fear and uncertainty. Critics argued that this explanation risked minimizing responsibility, while supporters viewed it as an honest reflection of Cold War pressures. For those affected, closure was uneven. Some received compensation, others received apologies, and many received nothing at all. The destruction of records made comprehensive accountability impossible. The absence of full transparency remained one of MKUltra's most lasting consequences. Yet change did occur. MKUltra reshaped the boundaries of acceptable state behavior. It reinforced the principle that national security does not grant unlimited authority, and that democratic societies must constantly renegotiate the balance between protection and personal freedom. The aftermath was not a clean resolution, but it was a reckoning. MKUltra is not merely a historical artifact. Its relevance persists in modern debates about surveillance, data collection, psychological influence, and government transparency. While methods have evolved, the core ethical questions remain unchanged. Today, technology allows unprecedented insight into human behavior. Algorithms predict preferences. Data reveals patterns once hidden. Influence no longer requires laboratories, it can operate silently through screens and systems. MKUltra reminds us that intent matters as much as capability. The program also challenges assumptions about democracy. It demonstrates that democratic institutions are not immune to overreach. They depend on vigilance, accountability, and an informed public willing to question authority. For younger generations, MKUltra serves as a warning against complacency. Rights are not permanent guarantees, they are maintained through oversight and ethical restraint. History shows that when fear dominates decision-making, values can erode quietly. In academic settings, MKUltra is studied not for its outcomes, but for its failures. It stands as an example of how scientific ambition, when detached from ethics, can cause lasting harm. Modern relevance lies not in repeating the past, but in recognizing its patterns. MKUltra urges us to ask difficult questions before crises force rushed answers. It reminds us that secrecy, when normalized, becomes dangerous. History does not repeat exactly, but it often echoes. MKUltra was never just about experiments. It was about choices made in quiet offices, justified by fear, and hidden behind classification stamps. It was about what happens when power operates without transparency, and when urgency replaces ethics. This story does not ask us to reject institutions or deny the reality of global threats. It asks something more difficult, to remember that principles matter most when they are hardest to uphold. The individuals affected by MKUltra were not symbols or statistics. They were people whose trust was misplaced, whose consent was ignored, and whose experiences were buried for decades. Remembering them is not about blame, it is about responsibility. Dark chapters in history are uncomfortable, but forgetting them carries a greater cost. Awareness is not about reopening wounds, it is about preventing repetition. As we look forward, MKUltra stands as a reminder that vigilance is not optional in a free society. Transparency, accountability, and ethical restraint are not obstacles to security, they are its foundation. History speaks quietly. It is up to us to listen.